On the high plains of Wyoming, he played with a borrowed basketball, shooting at a hoop mounted on a windmill. His taller, older brother called him a runt.
And I'd go to shoot a shot, he'd shove it in my face, and I got to thinking, how can I get up over that big bum one way or another? And so I figured, well, I'll try jumping. And the crazy thing went in. He was surprised, and so was I.
He was the first guy that came off of 2 feet and came up and released the ball with one hand. And he continued to develop the jump shot during his years at Wyoming.
Years in which the Wyoming men's basketball team barnstormed the East Coast, beating Georgetown for the NCAA title and then taking on St. John's for the College World Championship.
The basketball season's grand finale, given greater significance tonight as the American Red Cross reached the $28,000 benefit at Madison Square Garden's capacity crowd, and a killer-diller game it is. Wyoming scores. Seconds later, St. John's Redmond retaliated as Boykoff cages a field goal. What hangs on this ball game amounts to a national basketball crown. Both teams the kingpins of their respective loops.
And there in the Garden, leaping above taller players with a jump shot never seen before in the era of the flat-footed set shot, was the little point guard from the Wyoming Plains, who captured the imagination of sports fans across the nation, Kenny Sailors.
He did things with the basketball that even today you don't see.
He's coming at you. He's going to your throat. He's going to lock you down defensively. He's going to dominate you. He's going to intimidate you. He's going to wear you out. If you want to beat Kenny Sailors, you better bring a big sack lunch, because it's going to take you a while. Thinking of contributions to basketball, the first guy that developed the modern jump shot.
Today, when Kenny Sailors shows up at the University of Wyoming Arena Auditorium, players 70 years his junior stop by to greet him. They know who he is. He's the man who led the Cowboys to national fame before their parents were born, or their grandparents. But they don't know the whole story. A modest man, Sailors won't tell them he was a National College Player of the Year, twice an All-American, and an NCAA Tournament Most Valuable Player, or that he's in the College Basketball Hall of Fame. He's too modest to say he played in the first season of the league that would become the NBA, that he coached high school girls' basketball teams to championships in Alaska, or that he is credited, by many, with an invention that revolutionized the game, the jump shot.
There's still kids today who need to work on that, too.
All those accomplishments may get you into the Hall of Fame.
Your class of 2012.
But still, it's not the whole story. It was not the most auspicious beginning for a basketball champion. A hard-scrabble farm in Wyoming's southeast corner. A broken family with little money. A basketball hoop tied up to a windmill. A big brother who was much bigger.
I thought I could beat anybody, but I found out my big old brother, he was good enough and big enough to give me trouble. And I was probably in the 6th grade when they first started out. I'd dribble, but I couldn't get around him even in those days with my dribble. He was good enough that he could, and he just blocked the shots, and I got tired of it. I kept thinking about how I could get a shot off over him.
In those days, basketball was earthbound. Players used the flat-footed set shot.
But I just dribbled up to him and jumped. When I got up, I suppose I was at least 2 feet off of the ground.
And he did that because he could get his bigger brother moving and then just quickly, jump up in the air and shoot the ball, and he could then compete with an older brother.
National fame on the basketball court was not on anyone's mind at the Sailors' farmstead. Sailors' father had left the family when Kenny was born in Nebraska, the 6th child. Cora Sailors wanted to raise her children in the country, away from cities, and she ended up in Little Hillsdale, Wyoming, east of Cheyenne.
My mother was a disciplinarian from the word go. And I remember my job and my mother right out there with me in the summertime, hot. Boy, it was hot down there. My brother would cultivate with the horses that horse-drawn cultivator and get the weeds on the side of the rows of potatoes, but then the weeds in between and right up next to the potatoes, you had to either pull them up by hand or cut them out with a hoe. Well, that was my mother's job and mine. And I suppose I was 9 years old at the time, maybe 10, but not very old. And I made a mistake one day. I was hot and thirsty and hungry. I was always hungry. And I said, Mom, I'm getting awful tired of this hoeing potatoes. She didn't answer me for a while, and I knew something was wrong. And she finally said, well, son, if you really feel that way, just take your hoe and go to the house. Well, I knew the way she said it. It didn't sound just right. She says, Kenneth, that's what she called me, take your hoe and go to the house and just don't come to the supper table tonight. I could have eaten a dead skunk roadkill right then. That's how hungry I was, you know. And I picked up my hoe and started hoeing, and I never ever mentioned not wanting to hoe again.
Basketball was a big man's game even then. Every change of possession began with a jump ball. And unlike his 6'5" brother Bud, Kenny Sailors was well south of 6 feet tall. But he was an athlete in football, in track, and in basketball. When brother Bud entered college in Laramie, Cora Sailors moved the family there. Her younger son, just entering high school, was reluctant to leave Hillsdale.
And I wanted to stay, naturally. I didn't know about anything else, you know. I really wanted to stay. I didn't want to leave Hillsdale. And we had a good junior high team. We beat everybody, Egbert, Burns, Carpenter, the whole bunch. We beat them all.
But Kenny Sailors thrived in Laramie, on and off the court. 4 years later, he enrolled at the University of Wyoming and went out for basketball. Coach Everett Shelton was initially unimpressed with Sailors and his other freshmen. He was still under 6 feet tall, but he was a skilled dribbler and passer, and he had the jump shot.
I didn't shoot it all that much my first year or two because I didn't know what the coaches would think.
Freshmen in those days couldn't play on the varsity, but the young kids from Casper, Cheyenne, and Laramie were more than ready to play against the varsity.
We were smarting off in the dressing room, in the shower. We'd say to these varsity players, you know, well, looky, us freshmen could beat you any time of the year if you did play us a game. And Shelton heard us, and I don't know whether he got kind of disgusted with it or what, but he said, looky, you freshmen, you cocky freshmen, if you think you can beat my varsity, I'll arrange a game, and you can play them and let the people come in and watch it. Tickled us to death. We knew we could beat them. And so he did. But I think Ev began to realize that maybe he had something in us Wyoming kids, and he began to work with us, yeah.
Kenny Sailor's natural talents included everything but height. He was fast, he could dribble, he played smart, and to make up for that lack of height, he could jump.
And it was a non-jumping, non-leaping game. Ev Shelton, who's a Hall of Fame coach, had never seen that shot before, but he was smart enough to know that Kenny could do this and he could gain an advantage on his opponents, and so he let him shoot it.
And Shelton was smart enough to know his teams of the early 1940s had big-time potential.
He told us that right from the beginning. He said, boys, he said, now, I've won AAU national championships. I want to win a national championship at the college level. At least that's what I come here for. I think you guys can help me do it.
One problem, finding opponents strong enough to test the Cowboys. They played some of the best college teams in the West and then went up against more experienced teams from the AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union.
And these AAU teams were sponsored by different companies. You had Akron Goodyear, you had Phillips 66 Oilers, you had all kinds of these teams that eventually became NIBL, National Industrial Basketball League. But this is where a bunch of ex-college players went to continue playing because there was no NBA.
Phillips 66, who were, that year was the national AAU champions. We went down there. We beat them both times. The last one was an overtime.
The Cowboys went to the NCAA tournament in 1941 and lost. But they had captured the imagination of Wyoming.
Dad, who was a great athlete in his own right, loved the game, loved the University of Wyoming, and he took us to every game that he could possibly take us to. I was 13 years old at the time, growing up, and I watched Kenny play, but this guy was just astounding.
Eb Shelton, he had a mantra, we'll play anybody, anytime, anywhere, and so usually he would take the team 3-day trip back to New York City and play everybody that would play back on the East Coast in December and half of January before school started second semester.
And he said, now for us, a school like Wyoming, who's never been in the big time before, as far as college ball is concerned, he said, we can't do that playing out here in Wyoming. He said, we've got to go to where the center of basketball publicity is, and that's out of Madison Square Garden in New York City. First time I ever rode on a train overnight from Laramie to Chicago. We wake up, get on here, and go to bed, and wake up in the morning, we're in Chicago. Oh, you know, I'd never been out of the state of Wyoming before. And to go to New York and look up at those buildings, you know, and I remember the first time I went in the garden and they introduced us individually and we'd walk out on the court and here I am, a country kid from Hillsdale, and I walked out there and I looked around, here's people sitting all the way around. You had to look up like that to see them.
It was 1943. Once again, Wyoming was in the NCAA tournament, playing first in the regionals in Kansas City and then on to the finals in New York City. The opponent was Georgetown. Shelton was an innovative, daring coach. His players learned to work a weave and set screens to free up shooters. Shelton had Kenny Saylor's ball handling talents and, of course, the jump shot. They won the NCAA championship. Kenny Saylor's was the most valuable player. By now, the jump shot was part of the Wyoming offense, another element in the cowboy game that would make them crowd favorites in the big city. But they weren't ready to leave. They had another goal, a world championship.
The NIT was really the elite event. Part of that, I think, was because of the heavy population concentration on the East Coast. And with newspapers in New York, and they just took on a higher profile, and it was the event, greater than the NCAA championship. But obviously, things have changed since then.
And back in those days, there was an argument which was the best tournament, the NIT or the NCAA. And it was our old coach that went to the general manager of Madison Square Garden and said, well, let's settle this thing once and for all. He said, let's play a benefit game, give the money to the Red Cross or somebody, and said, Wyoming will play St. John's. We'll play you right here in the garden.
For Everett Shelton and his Cowboys, the limelight grew ever brighter.
St. John's rapid-fire scoring here in the past few minutes has tied up the game. But then the Cowboys again as Kamenik takes a bow. A moment later, a looping pass down court. Moschetti, St. John's takes a shot at the cords, and the Red Men score. Slick, smart, and speedy are these shifty sharpshooters.
The game seesawed back and forth. New York fans jumped to their feet and yelled. Sports writers pounded their typewriters. They didn't even have a name then for Kenny's shot. And that wasn't the only thing about Saylor's game.
He was looking to make his teammate points. He wanted to win. He was the ultimate team man. His ball handling was way ahead of its time.
He was a real competitor. I mean, I just talked to him right now, and I'd love to have coached him because I'm telling you, he would force his will on you just right now.
There are sports bar arguments about who invented the jump shot back in the 1930s and 40s, but many credit Kenny Saylor's as the first.
Not only is Kenny Saylor one of the great players of all time, he's the guy who first thought of the idea of shooting a jump shot. Played for the University of Wyoming, 5'10". He led Wyoming to the 1943 NCAA championships. They did beat Georgetown in the final game. Patrick did not play in that game. He's not quite that old, but tonight he's going to be enshrined in the College Basketball Hall of Fame. Please give a round of applause for Kenny Saylor.
Since I've been here, I've been asked by quite a few people, if I'm happy to be here. And, at 92 years of age, you're happy to be anywhere.
For basketball players today, the jump shot seems like the most natural thing in the world. But 75 years ago, it wasn't. James Naismith, who invented the game in 1891, had no such notion. He didn't even imagine the dribble or the dunk. So when they say Kenny Saylor's thought up the jump shot, it's true. And many people, from 10-year-olds at the playground to experts in sports science, are still trying to figure out how it works.
I mean, the average kid can't just go out and the first time and shoot a jump shot without working at it a while. Timing, so important. When you release the ball, squaring up with the basket, your feet have to hang straight down for balance.
Boyi Dai is a professor in the kinesiology and health department at the University of Wyoming.
You're throwing a basketball to a target. So all it matters is your release height, the speed, the angle, and the rotation, which will be related to the air resistance. So what do you want to achieve with all those four aspects? You want to achieve a high release height, and because the higher you release, the closer you to the basket. So when you push against the ground, actually you did transfer a part of the vertical force you get from the ground. Therefore, you reach a combination of release height, horizontal velocity, vertical velocity, and backspin. After those four components are determined, then where the basketball will go.
There's the skitty counting again for St. John's. The game now, a deadlock, goes into 5 minutes overtime. Wyoming's Big Jim Lear paces the Westerners to the front, and there they stay. Final count 52-47, and Wyoming's Cowboys are the undisputed kings of the court.
I think that Kenny's 43 team, I think they beat the top military team. They beat the top AAU champion. Tremendous record if you just really kind of know the history of it. It was a clean sweep like you could never believe, and it was done by a bunch of Wyoming kids, basically.
Wyoming kids whose heads weren't allowed to get too big. Back in Laramie, they were just local boys in school, most of them playing with no athletic scholarships.
But they did get you a job, and they got me a job in the Student Union building. I made big bucks. I got 25 cents an hour and got my board out of it.
One day, Kenny Sailors waited on a student at the Union, a fellow named Stan Hathaway, who'd brought along another student, a young woman.
Her name was Marilyn Corbin. I waited on him. I don't know what they ordered, Cokes or something. And old Stan said to me, he said, "Sailors, you ought to take Marilyn to the Fidel dance." And it really embarrassed me, but I didn't have much choice. I said, "Marilyn, would you go to the Fidel dance with me?" She said, "Sure, I'll go with you." That's where it all started. Old Stan Hathaway played Cupid, I guess.
Cupid, of course, would later become Governor Stan Hathaway. But long before that, in 1943, both Hathaway and the newly married Kenny Sailors performed another kind of service. Like a lot of young Wyoming men and women, they enlisted. The United States had entered World War II.
My first assignment of duty was to San Diego Marine Corps Base, Recruit Depot. When I got there, they had a ball team, basketball team. We played the best teams we could get to come in there and play us. But anyway, this old general came in, and first release he gave to the press was, "Are we playing basketball or are we fighting the war?" And he was right, and you get right down to it. Yeah. He said, "I want these guys out of here within 2 weeks." Boy, we were gone. Yeah. We headed for the South Pacific.
Sailors served on the troop transport ship R.E. Callan, where he commanded 40 Marines in charge of security. Mustered out in 1946, Kenny Sailors came home to Wyoming and his wife Marilyn. He was taking graduate courses, he still had a year of eligibility to play basketball, and the Cowboys, still coached by Everett Shelton, picked up where they left off, taking the team back east again to Madison Square Garden. One of the teams they played was Long Island University.
I believe it was January 3rd, 1946. Life magazine back then was one of the most circulated magazines in the United States and around the world. And Life magazine photographer took a picture of Kenny Sailors shooting the modern jump shot. Went all over the United States and other parts of the world. And so everybody, for the first time, really, the light came on, Kenny Sailors and the jump shot.
In 1946, Kenny Sailors again became an All-American, but he was denied the chance to win another NCAA championship. He was a graduate student and therefore ineligible under tournament rules.
I think we could have won it again in '46 if they'd have left us.
When your college basketball career ended in the 1930s and 40s, there were no multi-million-dollar contracts, no endorsement deals, no movie stars on your arm. However, in 1946, the year Kenny Sailors finished his college career, promoters were looking for a way to fill big city arenas used mainly for hockey. They formed the Basketball Association of America.
It was a time where there were probably 8 pro teams. And to be a professional, you were really one of the select few. He made it in a big man's game that not many people of his stature did.
But the Pro League in the early days was new and unstable. Kenny Sailors was sold or traded from team to team and wore 7 different uniforms.
I don't know how come I ended up with these teams that all of them folded up. And then I came to Denver, and they didn't even finish the first year. And same thing with Cleveland. I ended up with Baltimore, and I stayed there, I think, a couple of years. And I was getting old enough by that time that I wanted to go home, be with my family.
After 5 years, Kenny Sailors was finished with the NBA.
If he's not the oldest NBA pensioner, he is one of the 2 or 3 oldest at 92. Think about this. Just a kid from the farm in Wyoming, before Jordan, before anybody, he brought the jump shot to the NBA.
By 1951, his pro career over, as far as the basketball world was concerned, Kenny Sailors had vanished from the face of the earth.
I just disappeared from sight. After my NBA years, what happened to Sailors? Did he die? Where'd he go?
Marilyn and Kenny Sailors had always enjoyed the outdoors together. For Marilyn's health problems, including asthma, the Jackson area and the Teton Wilderness were the answer.
We bought the Heart 6 Ranch from the money my wife had saved during the time I'd played. We operated that Heart 6 Ranch up in Jackson Hole for about 19 or 20 years.
Kenny Sailors may have disappeared from the national basketball scene, but he was still a famous figure in Wyoming. He tried his hand at politics in the early 1960s, running unsuccessfully for the U.S. House and Senate. But the other side of Kenny Sailors' nature, the side that thrived in the Teton Wilderness and the unpopulated wild, was heading in a different direction. The Sailors packed the car and drove to Alaska.
It's a place we'd always wanted to go to, and we started a guiding and outfitting business up there. And that's what Marilyn needed, because she had that emphysema and asthma so bad. And that's what that's the reason we went to Alaska. My wife and I homesteaded on the Gulkana River. Boy, what a neat river. Most of them are glacier fed, and they're murky and stuff, but this was a clear water river. You could dip it up with a cup and drink it right out of the river. It had a king salmon run, a Dolly Varden run in the fall, and a red salmon run. You talk about fishing. And then just normally, summer or winter, it had a good rainbow and grayling fishing. So man, I fish it every day when I'm up there.
It was primarily a hunting operation, so there was time during the off-season for teaching and, not surprisingly, coaching. He worked first in the schools near his outfitting camp in Glen Allen, Alaska, and then further afield.
On Admiralty Island, in the little Indian village, Tlingit Indian village of Angoon. Beautiful, beautiful country over there. But they had a great big bell. I don't know where they got it. And they had it hanging somewhere there in town. And when an old brown bear or grizzly come into the village somewhere, where they'd beat on that big old bell. And mamas is running out, grabbing their kids and going to the house, right? There's a bear going through town.
Sailors convinced the Alaska Public Schools to begin a girls' basketball program. He coached state champions in the Tlingit community, where the people loved the game as much as he did.
Did they love to eat? You better believe they loved basketball. That's their whole life. In that little town of Angoon, I think they had 5 gymnasiums. I'll tell you, it was something else. Everybody played basketball. These old boys in their 70s out there playing basketball. Yeah, and the women.
The fun ended, though, as Marilyn Sailor's health worsened. Her husband brought her back down to the lower 48 in 1999. She passed away in 2002.
Married to her just a month short of 60 years.
Kenny Sailors was back in Laramie, at the basketball court, encouraging young players. Players who know only that he won the last national championship for Cowboys basketball back in 1943. Of the 7 decades journey since then, and the many ways he won in life, they know next to nothing.
Generally, somebody who was successful on the court also turns out to be pretty successful in their life in terms of how they went on beyond college and impacted people and impacted their profession, their chosen profession.
I guess truthfully, if I want to talk about what I respect most about Kenny Sailors, is what a hell of a man he is.
And you know, they've asked me, what does it mean to you, Kenny? What does it mean to you to get into the Hall of Fame? I said, I'm honored, and I realize it's probably the last honor that I'll get at my age. And I said, but in a lot of people's minds, it's the greatest. But I said to this one sports writer that was giving me a little bit of trouble on it, and I got about half griped about the way he was approaching it. And I said, well, now looky, you don't worry about these man-made halls of fame. I said, I belong to the greatest hall of fame that any man or woman can ever belong to. But I said, it's not down here, it's up there.